Facing a criminal case for sex trafficking and sex trafficking conspiracy, multiple civil cases by alleged victims, and a Department of Justice inquiry into his wrist-slap plea deal in Florida, Jeffrey Epstein's suicide has opened a flurry of questions about the future status of his legal proceedings. As for the criminal charges, those are effectively kaput. As former prosecutor Renato Mariotti explains, Jeffrey Epstein's suicide ends the criminal case against him because no one else was charged in the indictment. Many questions remain. How much more about Epstein's alleged sex trafficking ring will come to light? Will others be indicted? What might we find out from the FBI and Department of Justice inquiries into Epstein's suicide? Former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid spoke about where the legal proceedings involving the case of the sex offender go from here. How much information about Epstein and his co-conspirators will never be known because the criminal case against him closes with his death. Barbara McQuaid said it could be quite a bit. His case will no doubt be dismissed. You can't have a prosecution without a defendant, so it will probably be dismissed Monday morning. She went on to say, but I do think it is likely that investigators will continue to investigate any co-conspirators who are involved in the case. We know the names of some of the women who were assisting him, and there is also the interesting and unusual language in the plea agreement out of the Southern District of Florida about granting immunity to any potential co-conspirators. What about Epstein's knowledge, now lost, of his own alleged crimes, passwords, knowing where records are, information like that? McQuaid said if he wanted to provide truthful information, he likely could have implicated any others involved by providing testimony or photos or documents, though I think a search warrant was already executed at his home, so investigators likely already had at least some of that. Does his death make it less likely that charges will be brought against other people? Her response, there was a possibility of him as a cooperator. He obviously had a strong incentive to share information, to reduce his own prison sentence. That possibility of him sharing important information that could have exposed co-conspiracies, that's gone with his death. But I think there's still an incentive to investigate the reasons for his lenient guilty plea, and anyone who might have been assisting or sharing in sex trafficking. I think the investigation will continue. There's plenty of incentive for it to continue. McQuaid said, I think you can still maintain the civil cases. The defamation cases, those should continue. It makes it difficult because you don't have him. You can't continue to take the depositions or do the things you might want to do with the case. But those cases will continue. The Inspector General maintains the ability to look into misconduct because there was possible institutional misconduct. The idea that the apparatus has problems that need to be corrected. So I think the Inspector General should continue to investigate. So there are no confirmed reports of a cooperation agreement between the government and any Epstein co-conspirators. But if one was theoretically in place to help prosecute Epstein, could it be thrown away to prosecute that cooperating co-conspirator? Our response is, I don't know if it'd be thrown out. If there's still potential investigative information that the person had, that would still be available for others. It might stay. If they were solely cooperating against Epstein, that's an interesting question. Typically, to get credit, you have to provide information that assists in the investigation or prosecution of others. If he's dead, it's hard to imagine that it could still amount to substantial assistance. They might lose their ability to provide something of value. I would think that there still may be value in their cooperation if they are sharing information about others. If it's solely about Epstein and he is dead, that theoretical person might be out of luck. If I were involved in the case, I'd still want to talk to them to find out what they know about others. Regarding his suicide in jail after a reported suicide attempt in July, it seems like the prosecutor may have miscalculated. Seeing his first attempt as an effort to get out of jail, where does the responsibility for his death fall? With the prosecutor, the Metropolitan Correctional Center? Mr. McQuaid said, I think it is the Bureau of Prisons, which takes care of inmates and detainees. Somebody makes a decision on whether or not an inmate goes on suicide watch. It's hard to imagine why he wouldn't still be on suicide watch. On July 23rd, Epstein had been found semi-conscious in a cell with marks on his neck. He was taken off suicide watch on July 29th. It seems like someone facing these kinds of charges, for that reason alone, they should be on suicide watch. The fact that he attempted and failed previously seems like he would have qualified, although I don't know what the BOP criteria is and whether it was met. What sort of things might we learn from the FBI investigation into Epstein's death and the DOJ Inspector General's investigation into Epstein's death, which both were announced today? McQuaid said if no charges are filed, we may not find out anything. If the FBI is involved, they are looking into it as a possible crime, not negligence by BOP. Was he murdered? That could be one thing I'd be looking at. Did a fellow inmate or guard kill him? That would be another thing. The other would be a civil rights violation, that he was beaten by guards or something like that. Politicians on both sides of the aisle were quick to express their alarm over what happened. Senator Ben Sasse, the Nebraska Republican who chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee, said on Saturday that it was inexcusable that this rapist was not under constant suicide watch, and that by letting Epstein take his own life, the federal government had failed Epstein's victims for the second time. Obviously, heads must roll, Sasse added in a letter to Attorney General William Barr. Every single person in the Justice Department, from your main Justice Headquarters staff all the way to the night shift jailer, knew that this man was a suicide risk, and that his dark secrets couldn't be allowed to die with him. It should have been abundantly clear that Epstein would go to any lengths to avoid being held accountable for his crimes, including by killing himself. Being responsible for Epstein's custody and prosecution, the Department of Justice should not have allowed this to happen. Finally, federal prosecutors said Saturday that their investigation into Epstein remains open. U.S. Attorney General Jeffrey Berman issued a statement making it clear that the investigation into Epstein remains open, and he encouraged other potential victims to come forward. To those brave young women who have already come forward and to many others who have yet to do so, let me reiterate that we remain committed to standing for you, and our investigation of the conduct charged in this indictment, which included a conspiracy count, remains ongoing, Berman said. David Boyce, another attorney for alleged Epstein victims, espoused a similar message, saying that the financier's death closes only one chapter of the legal battle. Jeffrey Epstein did not act and could not have acted alone with what he did. Justice demands those who acted with him be held accountable, he said. Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive this morning in his cell in his bed and was cold to the touch when correctional officers entered to wake him for breakfast. Sources say there were no injuries visible, and they began chest compressions while EMS were en route. Epstein was dead hours before EMS responded because his body was stone cold, according to EMS. Epstein wouldn't have been able to commit suicide if he was truly being watched, which means foul play is likely involved. Even if Epstein didn't commit suicide, because let's be honest, nobody believed Epstein actually committed suicide. If he was being watched, like he was supposed to be, according to prison protocol, how did it take hours for guards to realize he was dead? Epstein was found cold and unresponsive by EMS, and was not considered a patient, even though EMS is heard saying, working cold. Sources also tell us there were no apparent injuries visible on Epstein's body. So I ask you, and please comment below, if there were no injuries on Epstein's body, how in the world has his death been deemed suicide already without an autopsy? The suicide of Jeffrey Epstein, what the heck, let's call it what it really was, a politically necessary execution, reeks of the suicide of Craig Spence back in 1989. Spence was a Republican lobbyist with deep ties to the Reagan presidency. He ran a Washington callboy service, and like Epstein, had the goods on many of America's decadent elite. After his sex racket exploded in the headlines, Spence told friends he would probably be murdered, a termination that would be called a suicide. And guess what? In November of 1989, Spence was indeed found suicided in a Ritz-Carlton hotel room in Boston. A list of prominent names who Jeffrey Epstein had dirt on, including videos and photos, is endless. And Epstein's ties to intelligence services, including U.S. and Israeli agencies, are equally obvious. This is how the elite and the secret police under their command operate. Key witnesses to get paid off or permanently disappear. But the Epstein case is so obvious, it shows that the U.S. oligarchy has become so cocky it doesn't even pretend to be lawful anymore. For decades, the corporate media have been ridiculing and condemning those who believe that power in the U.S. often operates in a darkly clandestine way. The New York Times, Washington Post, TV networks have all worked feverishly to marginalize the deep investigative work done by citizen researchers and independent journalists, such as the Patriot Soapbox, In Pursuit of the Truth, the X-22 Report, and many others. And they work endlessly, often without compensation, to shed light on the national security. Pedophiles like Epstein, the assassination of President Kennedy, eye-opening investigation into 9/11, and the undeniable web of connections between Saudi royalty and the hijackers, U.S. agencies' foreknowledge of the hijacker plots, and the Bush-Cheney administration's cover-up of inconvenient 9/11 truths also are routinely blacked out by the mainstream media. But in the wake of this Epstein bombshell, now the C word, as in conspiracy, is even creeping into the prose of New York Times columnists like Paul Krugman. Sometimes the criminality at the top of America becomes so brazen, so obvious that even our press watchdogs are stirred from their slumber. Is it not time for Americans to tune out the mainstream crooked media and start listening to real investigative reporters that have no motive other than the safety and the future of our great nation?